Yeah.
You do that?
Yeah. Our design team.
What do you mean?
There. Oh, you're good.
Thanks for that, though. Thanks. I was feeling kind of
Excellent, thank you.
Morning.
Digging that hoodie, man.
Thank you.
And then eyeballing it all week. You know, passing it around. Don't leave it on a chair, is all I'm saying.
We're both very much like house hoodie people.
Yes.
I have like my sleeping hoodies, house hoodies.
Yep.
Awesome.
Good.
Do I need
Practice.
to plug you in? Or you just gonna-
Gotta have your comfort uniform.
I do have some.
That's it, man.
One's one of the little model.
You want to plug you in?
Do you
Yeah.
want to share that?
Yeah, why don't we do it?
Or do you want me to use it?
No,
What are you using?
PowerPoint, but I'll just move it over to you. You can just plug right in.
So I'm assuming the second half is still very much conversational.
Yes, very much.
But I kind of like the outline.
I just gotta get you a little bit over. It's not that long.
Check that mic for me, just so I can check the signal.
Testing.
You are? You're ready to be back in your home, your own bed.
I think so.
That's you, that's.
Canva?
This? No, I think I did on Keynote. But I usually export it as a PDF. So sometimes you get to places where they're like, oh, we don't have Keynote, or we don't have PowerPoint. I always have it in PDF so that.
There you go. I hate when you do that.
I would break down. That's why I just don't ever come with anything.
Well, because Pro Presenter, it's ridiculous. It's so easy to import if it's a PowerPoint. It does it all at once. But if you do a PDF, you have to do it one at a time. Figure that out, because everyone. You're right. I mean, PDF is nice because it stays the same. But it's like, show me how to import it all at once instead of like a slide at a time.
Yeah, so
I would
with
hate to be in
Pro
those
Presenter,
companies.
I
Like,
export images, right? Each slide.
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
just pull in the images.
Uh-huh.
But I'm going back to handwriting.
yeah.
I love you just use the chalkboard the first day. It's like, I like this. It's my style.
Well, they must have got like word from on how you were using the chalkboard, because then after the session I was still in here. And, like the janitor guy came in and put like you take the chalk around. I probably was like, I've been having this box for a decade. I'm so glad I finally get to put it out there. He's like, I got new chalk. So we're going to get started here. A couple quick things. On the center of all your tables is kind of an assessment for the week. I've been coming to Order of the Flame for 6 years, and every year we do some major changes based on the feedback that we hear. And so, and I'm an idea guy, so a lot of the new ideas we try aren't successful. And so we might have tried some new ones this year that you're like, that was like the worst. And so it doesn't hurt anyone's feelings, but just be as honest as you like, saying for the future of this, when other people come behind you, we can make changes accordingly to make it as great as a thing as possible. And so feel free to share what you liked, what you didn't like, anything in between, any new ideas on topics or ways that we can improve. And then probably the most important thing for the team of people for World Methodist Evangelism is you are better positioned to know who might fit this conference. You're better positioned than anyone else. And so the last question says, like, who are people that you would say this would be a great conference for? It's obviously not for everyone, and so rather than just expecting bishops and DSs and others to give Kim and Rob and others some, like, here's some people. You've been here, you've experienced it now. If you have friends, colleagues, people in your community, your conference, friends from school that you say, man, I think they'd really like that, please put down their information. And if you don't know it, like if you just put their name and stuff, they can try to track them down. So the goal today, and you're going to have more time at the end of this session to get that done because they'd love for it to be turned in before you head to lunch. We'll give you time to do that for sure. And so our goal today is to be as practical as possible and as kind of group discussion focused as possible. We've talked about we've talked about reconciliation, justice, shalom, these concepts, like how do we live out the gospel. And so we're going to kind of go through how we do that with creating dialogues in our communities and churches. How do we preach about that? How do we do some asset-based planning? And then just really open it up for questions or insights that you have. And so we just want you to leave not feeling like your questions or the things you wanted to talk about you didn't have time for. So Luigi's going to start us with just some basics on how to do intergroup dialogue. And then we're going to talk about preaching with Mike, just some ideas on how you preach on these things. And I'll talk a little bit about asset-based mapping, and then we'll just have discussion. So.
Yeah, so one of the hardest things about whether it's racial reconciliation or just difficult conversations, we've seen in our political arena how polarizing conversations can be. And usually what's being modeled in the church or in the media is either discussion or debate. Which what it means is that you either have a winner and a loser at the end of the day, or in a sense is the defense of arguments that I already have. So I enter into a conversation with a preconceived idea of I know my position on this, I know how to deal with this, and the reality is there's no dialogue. It's just a discussion where and you can see that, and it's actually uncomfortable. You see it in your families when you get together for a holiday and someone brings that one issue that no one is willing to bend on, but they just kind of bring the preconceived ideas. And in churches, often the parishioners just simply hear unilaterally from their pastor. And sometimes as pastors we think they're getting it, I'm really casting vision, and we just never hear from them to see what are their objections, how do they see things. So there's a lot of groups trying to work on what's known as intergroup dialogue. The University of Michigan did a project on how do we bring people to the table to have difficult conversations. And the whole idea of intergroup dialogue is really to explore, not even to persuade, but to explore different conversations, explore social identities, issues of social justice, communication across differences, conflict and community. And it's a really simple model, and other universities have taken it. We've implemented it university-wide at Indiana Wesleyan University. We've had small groups, some with faculty, some with administrators, with students, to try to practice this simple model of dialogue. So the first thing is there's like 5 stages, but the first thing is setting the environment. And if you were here yesterday, I think Mike and Chase demonstrated brilliantly how to set the environment on a difficult conversation. Often with intergroup dialogue, you need to have at least 2 moderators, and hopefully they will represent different views or different perceptions
on what you were talking about. So if it's racial reconciliation, well, you want to have people that represent different views in that dialogue, so that when you bring people together to talk about it, you actually feel well represented, or at least you feel that the conversation is going to be decentralized. So when there is a dialogue on immigration and there is only one moderator from one ethnicity, it does not represent or permit for other voices to enter into the dialogue. So one of the things that is, and you don't need to have experts on subjects, all you really need to do is bring representation. We've done an interfaith dialogue in our community. And so then you bring moderators that represent, here is Scott, he's a rabbi, and here's Luigi, he's a Christian pastor, and here is Kalima, who is a Muslim, and that just decentralizes the dialogue. But to set the environment, you need to set some rules. And here is where it's actually really fun. You bring a group together, whether in the church or in the community, but you take time to set the rules of the game. There's nothing worse than when you are in a conversation and someone just kind of violates this dialogue and everybody feels unsafe, and all of a sudden you default to silence or violence. So you can go to those two extremes. So one of the things that we do is we set a covenant, which is an agreement, mutual agreement of how are we going to have a conversation. For instance, in our interfaith dialogue, we made part of the rule was, you're not here to convert me, right? And it was a written rule, and we talked about it, and that was part. We wrote it and said, I'm here to dialogue, to get to know, to ask questions. I want to know about the Muslim community in Indianapolis. I just want to know. I'm not here with an agenda. I'm not here to make you a Christian. And it was a mutual agreement, and we had rules like that. Rules like, you can ask any question and I will choose not to be offended, but be respectful. And you set the rules, and what's awesome is the group owns the rules. So they have to play by the rules that they stipulated. Sometimes we kind of want to create conversations and give people rules, but because they did not own them and share and propose them themselves, they feel like, yeah, the facilitators are giving us the rules, but they don't own those. So one of the things that works really well is you take a session even before you can have dialogue and say, how do we do this? How do we talk about this? Our dialogue was about violence to sacred places, and so the synagogue got tagged, and there's been attacks on mosques, and what's sad, this is what they told us: we want to have this dialogue because the people that are not showing up are evangelicals. Like, when something happens in the community, where are the evangelicals saying, like, hey, no, I have my own belief, but this is not okay. This cannot, we do not tolerate or approve of anything like this. And so we have this wonderful dialogue. So set the right environment, take the time. Sometimes you don't even have a dialogue the first time you meet, but you just kind of explore how to create a safe place. 2, develop communication skills. So sometimes it's important to help learn basic communication skills. So we do little exercises on listening carefully. So you take your group and say real quick, hey, meet with a Jew or with a Muslim, or find someone from a different ethnicity and just take 2 minutes, introduce yourself, and you create these moments where they have to listen, and then you bring them back to the group and say, okay, you met someone, tell us what you learned about this person, and you are coaching them into saying, I better listen because I have to communicate carefully what I heard. And all of a sudden you're creating a nice environment of listening carefully, seeing carefully. I do exercises about what do you see? What do you feel? What do you think? And so, for instance, we do exercises on say Zach is here, and what do I see? Well, let's do it with Mike. 'Cause let's make a covenant that everything I will say is respectful. Exercises where sometimes people say, well, I see a nice guy. Like, well, can you really see a nice guy? No, what do you see? Okay, I see a hat, I see glasses. What do you feel? Like, feel intimidated, or I feel he's too serious. I don't know. I feel those things. What do you think? And then you begin to coach people into, what I see, how I feel, and what I think are completely different. And in the dialogue, you explore those differences. All right, moving on. Exploring identities and relationships. This one is phenomenal, which is just creating a time where you really hear stories. Kalima in Indianapolis is the first Muslim woman to be the chairwoman of a Muslim organization. And just to hear that story and to see her struggle, that as a Muslim woman, she's gone through a lot of challenges and finally was chosen to be the chairwoman of the board. And to listen to that and celebrate, and as a Christian, like, I can listen to that story and value it, love it, and explore identities and ask questions because we have a covenant. So tell us, what are the struggles that you as a woman and a Muslim woman face in our community? And they begin to tell stories, and then you have a woman who is a pastor that says, I identify with what you're saying. Even in my own church, I get treated this way, and you begin to explore relationships and identities, and you're not converting each other. The reality is you discover that friendships develop in those situations. So exploring identities, relationships. Sometimes things don't go that well, and you see people defaulting to silence or violence. You got to start all over again. If that happens, there's triggers. Someone just kind of crossing hands and doesn't want to talk, and even though you are opening, you got to go back to the beginning and say, all right, let's go back to our covenant. Remember that we talked about these rules of the game. Everybody has to participate. We're going to ask questions with respect. If I don't understand, I have the freedom to ask, and you have to walk people through the same stages all over again, because if it's not safe, you cannot move on to dialogue. And notice that we haven't even done the heavy dialogue just yet. Embracing conflict, emotions, and triggers. Once you've explored, you get to know the people really well, it is a lot easier to explore conflict. In our dialogue in the city, for instance, we did this exercise. What do Jews think of evangelical Christians? And what do evangelical Christians think of Muslims? And we got all the evangelicals on one side, Jewish on another side, Muslims on another side, and they all had to tell the story of, well, this is what we think about you. And you had to take it and say, I can see how you think that, even though I don't think that we are as a community that way. For instance, that's when we learn, like, you guys don't show up. But it was kind, with rules, with covenants, and you begin to embrace the conflict, the real feeling of saying, like, what we want is evangelicals to show up. That's why we want that. And we can say, yeah, we can do that. So then you enter into, but how do we know when you need help? And then you begin to work together and saying, here is how we're going to communicate in the city so that there's responses when things happen. And then you exchange cell numbers, and that is the coolest thing when you're like, I got the cell of Rabbi so-and-so or Imam so-and-so, and like, and have access. And just like you get a text from someone that says, hey, have a blessed day. It's awesome when you could say, I did this, like my Google Calendar, I activated all the holidays from every other culture so that they pop up, and I can say, hey, here's a happy whatever holiday is going on, and it means so much so that you develop relationship. Triggers, recognize your triggers, and sometimes in the dialogue is like, when you say that about our group, what do you mean by that? I love how Chase and Mike yesterday talk about when we use the word black or white, there is such a baggage behind that, but what we mean by that is this, and you enter into exploring conflict, emotions, triggers, and all that. And finally, you end up talking about difficult things, very difficult things. But what is awesome is you begin to build alliances with people. Again, you have covenants. Alliances like, I may disagree with your understanding of sexuality, but I can agree that violence against a community that thinks or believes differently than me, that I will not accept that. I can come into an alliance where they know that perhaps we don't agree on certain issues. That's fine. But that when it comes down to justice, that you will stand, that you will not go silent, that you will say, no, I don't condone violence to a community. Does that make sense? So it gets tense, it gets difficult, but because you've gone through all these stages, the reality is you start building alliances that are really important in the city. So there's so many issues about immigration. People think so many different things about immigration, but can we agree and build an alliance that where there is injustice, that you will show up? And usually it's like, absolutely. Like, I see things differently than you, but I will show up if there is injustice, and you begin to work that out. So this is one of my favorite aspects of communication. I've done several of these groups and I love them. They work. Sometimes they backfire and you gotta go back to the beginning, start all over again. If you have multiple sessions, you always start in the beginning. Remember the covenant that we made? Is there anything else that we needed to add? Is there anything that you would want to remove? And begin all over again. But soon you're gonna see that you're able to dialogue and explore, and it's awesome when you can, expose. We've had Muslim families coming to our house now, and we have dinner with them, and Jewish families. We've done events at universities demonstrating what this dialogue looks like, and it's awesome when people feel safe and can talk about things that they have different feelings and they feel emotionally charged about things, but they find a place to dialogue.
Super practical before you keep having the mic. So I'm a white pastor, let's say, in a community, and there's issues maybe, let's say, with law enforcement, but I'm not impacted by it, but I want my people to understand how they're impacted by it. So maybe I reach out to an African-American pastor, and then is it like we say, hey, we don't want to do it with the whole church, like I want to bring like 10 of my leaders, and you bring 10 of your leaders, and let's have a dialogue? Or is it like at a certain time, is there a tipping point where, if it's only 4 people in the room, it's probably not enough to do this, but if there's 400 in the room, it's probably too big. Does that make sense? Like,
yes.
How do you, what's
so,
the...
Yeah. The reality is dialogue works well with small groups. And the small groups, probably, we're talking about 7 to 15 people would be very comfortable. Because you can manage the room, you can those who default to silence, you can press them gently and say, hey, remember we're having a dialogue, all of us. If you have 40 people, like, you will miss some voices. Now, some issues you need to take to a larger level, so you begin doing the intergroup dialogue, and then you bring it. We've done at Butler University a dialogue with university students, but because we had done our intergroup dialogue, it was easy to move into a larger setting and then model, and what they see is you doing the intergroup dialogue. But decentralizing power too, right? So in a dialogue where there's problems with the police authority, if they moderate the dialogue, they have the power. So you need to create a representation where it decentralizes, and they have to play by the rules. They don't come up with the rules of dialogue. They enter into the covenant agreement of a group to dialogue.
That's great. Mike's going to talk about preaching here, sure. In my community, for instance, there's it's called DWL, so that would be in Indiana driving without a license, but we call it driving while Latino, because there's a lot of profiling that happens, and if you're a brown person, you get pulled over and they ask to check your license, and a lot of our immigrants don't have licenses. So because of my role in the community and what I do with a lot of our immigrant population, they came to me and shared that the new police chief was doing this again. And so, I met first with all the police leadership to talk about it, but it was me talking. And so the next step is we're setting up a monthly gathering in our community where we can gather, 8 Latino and Latinas together with 8 of the police people, where it's not like a huge room where we're all like hurling insults at each other and getting defensive, but we can actually like listen and learn from one another. Just really important that I think the church has a role in that we live out the gospel message of what it means to we serve a God who we are reconciled to, and who has a desire to reconcile people, to each other as well. So really neat stuff. The other thing that most of you, as pastors, you're in a role where you get to teach from the platform on a regular basis. And so the question becomes, on these hot button issues, my degree is anthropology, like intercultural studies. I was a missionary overseas, and so I didn't take any of like the pastor classes, but then when I became a pastor, I learned that there were like certain things you weren't supposed to teach on. I didn't know that. I thought like what people talked about from Monday through Saturday was exactly what you should teach on. So I got in trouble sometimes with like my district superintendent, things like that. Like he visited and there was just like a court ruling from the Supreme Court and everyone was talking about it, so I scrapped the sermon and talked about it and all that. And so I just thought, like, how do you do this like with wisdom, with your congregation, with others? How do you preach and teach on concepts and topics that are polarizing and difficult? And so Mike's just going to share some pointers on that.
Before we do that, I want to be aware of, are there external processors in the room that need a moment to speak some stuff out loud that you've heard so far, or space to share some stuff? Yep.
I have a question, which this is not the best
Bring
time
it.
for it.
No, that's good. From here on, we're going to be just dialogue oriented. So let's talk.
As we're talking about this notion of setting the environment for dialogue, developing some kind of a covenant, I wonder what you do when folks aren't ready to enter into that space.
Sure.
Do you tell them they need to leave? I'm just curious how you handle
Yeah,
that.
first of all, don't move to the next stage until it's ready. So when there is apprehension and you really cannot get to the level of even begin to explore identities, it's difficult. You almost have to discern and saying, this is as far as this group allowed it to be, because you do need people on board. It's tough. The good thing of the rules is that it enables you to call people back to the covenant. So if they've agreed to it, you do hold them accountable to it. I was in one dialogue, and it was a higher up person in the university that would not want to abide by it. And the following dialogue, that person was not a part of it. Because the dialogue needed to happen, but that person was hindering. And ironically, it was a person that you would think would be on board and was never able to get on board. And then you sometimes need to take a step back and say, we're gonna do it, or we need to do it with different people, or we need to reduce the size of the group with people that are willing to abide by a covenant.
You mentioned when you're kind of setting the terms for the covenant, that you have to decentralize the power.
Mm-hmm.
And people with power don't like to give up that power. So how do you make that ask? How do you ask them to come to an equal table and ask them to give up some power in order to have a conversation when historically they've held all the power?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's why you do want to have moderators that represent different sides of the equation, so that at any given time you could model a disagreement, so that if Zach represents the voice of a white pastor leading a multi-ethnic church, I represent a voice of an immigrant, and in many ways, by reading the room, that's why developing the skills is important too. And sometimes we do a lot of exercises of body language and picking up on just cues, and so that the people in the room learn about that too, and saying, wait a second, if you are experiencing tension when someone says something, something is happening, and we want to address that, right? And we model that. Again, you don't want to have necessarily experts. I don't need to be an expert. I may just ask with an imam, like, I have no idea. Would you please answer this question? And model the decentralization of power. So it does need some leadership and skills in the sense that you are trying to manage the room, but not in a directive way, but in a mutuality agreement. Yes, but if those powerful want to hold on to power, it's very difficult. They want to either discuss or debate, but usually not dialogue.
That's good. I'm wondering if you could comment on the need for, trying to formulate this as I'm speaking, to ensure genuine respect versus sort of like a platitude of, yes, I'm gathered at the table to have this dialogue, and I respect you, but I'm more here to teach you. And not a way of like conversion, but in a way that is more closed to it within a discussion setting.
I think that's when you need to do a very good job at explaining what dialogue is. That what we want is dialogue. That at the end of the day, if you walk away thinking we won, like that was not a dialogue, right? Or I proved myself right. That's really not a dialogue, and this doesn't work for that. I mean, if you want to prove that Christianity is right and that I have all the apologetics to win the argument, then you need to set up a discussion where people really kind of watch the ping pong table, and they get to decide. I thought that guy did a pretty good job, but this is not that. This is almost your willingness to explore areas where you just don't know. You genuinely want to enter and know. I want to know and open that. So it is the difference between. I took world religions, taking several courses like that, but I never really befriended anyone that believes something differently, right? And so this was a space to really just explore and say, I'm not here I have my textbook knowledge, but tell me about that. So it's really exploring identities. And by the way, I now use this in other difficult conversations, like my mom and I have some difficult relationships, and sometimes we made this rule, some of our dialogues are going to be done in public, not with the family, not in the holidays. Part of a covenant is like, if you want to talk about that, and usually it's issues about faith. She's just a strong believer with strong convictions, and I am a strong believer with strong convictions, and sometimes we have conflict when it comes about Christianity. We're so stubborn, so we have a covenant. It's like we go to Panera where there's people and where neither of us can yell. and also that's awesome because it enables you we know Panera is cue for dialogue and exploring how you see things.
They still yell.
Well, but it's loud, so it's okay. But does that make sense? And it's awesome when I do it with my kids too. It's like, okay, we're gonna have some rules. The first rule, you cannot get angry at us. And that's covenant. And it's awesome because then it's like, okay, they're teaching me, coaching us. Now you probably think I'm an angry Christian or something like that, but I'm just trying to be honest so that you see the usefulness of entering into I don't know what happened, and I'm not here to get you in trouble, let's talk about this. Let's establish the rules. Let's listen to each other. And it's awesome when they call you on that too. Dad, it's my turn. Like, you already talked. Time to listen. Things like that. So, but yeah, if people are not willing, then you're just gonna tell them, man, this is not for you.
All right. So now we're going to move from the dialogue to the monologue, right? So how do you preach about this? How do you teach about this? What do you do with this? And the best framework I can give to us right now is Otis Moss III has a book, Blue Note Preaching in a Post-Soul World. And in that he talks about a little bit of the contradiction, but the mixing of the gospel shout and the blues moan in preaching. And depending on what tradition you come from, depending on your particular style of teaching and preaching, you're usually good at one, but not the other. And his concept is we have to have both, and sometimes we have to have both simultaneously. And we can celebrate, right? And we can lament. And we have to have spaces in our congregations, in our classrooms, in those sorts of areas where both of those things are happening. Okay? Everybody with me so far? So usually the stronger of those is the gospel shout, is a celebration, like, you know, resurrection, Jesus is Lord, amen, come on, let's get it, you know, whatever. It's hard to come on Sunday morning and say, today we're gonna weep for our community. We're gonna lament what's going on in the world. But as pastors, as teachers, we are supposed to exegete not only the scriptures, but the communities we are living in and society as a whole. And so the first thing I would say is, if you are in a predominantly white space, when something happens in a minority community that is tragic, that is painful, that is being talked about, you cannot ignore it just because your people may not feel the direct impact of that. You have to speak into that from a space of lament as a white person or as a leader of a white community. It is not easy by any means, but it has to be done if we're ever going to move into what Luigi just shared with us. If we're going to ever have the dialogues and some of those spaces, we have to be able to speak into that. And so we can't avoid things going on in society any more than we can avoid the hard scriptures, right? We've got to be able to read a scripture that is a little bit painful, like a voice of one crying out in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and think, that really is a great text to look at when we're talking about unarmed black kids being killed by police. Like, we have to come to that and say that speaks to that's difficult. I don't know how I'm going to speak about that, but like, I've got to do something with this. We've got to come to the hard passages. I mean, we have Psalms of lament. We have a book of Lamentations. We have the prophets that are speaking into these really hard spaces of violence and pain and suffering. I think Dave did a great job this morning of kind of, or maybe even yesterday, I think is when he started that conversation of the whole gospel. You know, it's a both and. It's not just the celebration, it's the other. He was speaking into that as well. So when we're talking about this, we can't avoid those things. We also, on the other side of that, if we swing the other way, can feel really heavy all the time. And so we can't just speak into the hard things without then turning into, Jesus is still Lord in the midst of the pain, the midst of the suffering, and those sorts of things. We've got to be able to work both of those concepts into the things that we are doing. Everybody with me? Okay. I would like to hear now. Oops, over there.
I was going to say, how do you know? I mean, if any of us watch the news, I mean, there's lots going on. Like, how do you gauge when?
Yep.
especially if it's not your community that's impacted, if it's like the wider community. Does that make sense? And so for me, it's like, if it's immigration, it's like I can know, okay, this is what he's talking about.
Yeah,
But if it's African Americans, it's like, that's not, our community doesn't have a lot of African Americans in our county. So
Yes.
it's like, when do I?
Yeah. So, if you wait for it to happen in your neighborhood, like, you won't do that well. You know what I mean? Like, if I wait for someone to be murdered in my community before I ever speak about the issues of violence in the world, right? Like, that's going to be a blubbering mess, you know? So I would say if you're starting down that, you've got to take a big picture. So most everybody's going to be talking about the coronavirus, you know, last Sunday, this Sunday. We're going to talk about that because that's a world, you know, like same kind of thing. If there's a known thing globally or at least nationally or something like that, we've got to be able to softly speak into that from those two spaces, so that when something does happen locally that maybe isn't on the news but that affects our direct congregations, then we're able to get into that a little more. Does that answer your question? Okay. So my point, if you walk away with anything from me today, it's like, do not wait. Like, go on back this Sunday and talk about some of the issue in the world and just lament and repent and have a little, just a little moment here and there, just about things, just to enter into those spaces so that your congregation is hearing from you, your classrooms are hearing from you about some of the things going on in the world. Do any of you have your own spaces of lament, like a consistent rhythm of like spiritual discipline of lament? Okay, so let me talk about that a little bit. So when the grief of the world is on you, right? And I don't mean about social injustice. I do mean about that, but not only about that, but I mean your own spaces of grief when the weight is hitting you and stuff's going on. It is a good spiritual discipline to have a space and a time to go be by yourself and just to weep. You know, you don't have to be a crier to do, but to be and just to grieve and cry out to God and get that off. God, this is I hate this and this is horrible and I need you know, not just like Jesus help me, but like the crying out kind of spaces. We all need that because that's emotionally healthy for us, but it's also biblically healthy for us because they do that throughout the scriptures, right? So having a space where you're able to do that yourself helps you enter into those moments of teaching on some of those spaces of grief in your own community in the world and those sorts of things. So I would highly encourage all of you to, I mean literally create a space where, like, when I'm overwhelmed, when I am to go to that space and sit there and just get it all out, you know, and we all know this, but like God can take whatever you say, right? Like, big enough to handle your language and your blubbering and your bad theology when you're in those moments and all that kind of stuff, and just get that. Yeah.
And I don't think this is exactly what you're speaking to, and I think that there's a way to set up that time and that space. But as a chaplain, for me, it was important to in those years to do some of that just in the car on the drive home, so that I didn't carry that into my home and with my family and everything else. So sometimes those spaces are small and whatever, but when you said that, it kind of spoke to me in that regard, and that sometimes we deal with something at work, you know, at the hospital or with someone that comes in to talk to us, and we've got to somehow process that amongst ourselves before we walk back into our homes or pick up our kids and just somehow unleash it on them in an unhealthy way. So
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, for sure. Good.
Sorry, I'm a verbal processor and I don't like formulate things well in my brain.
I love that. Go for it.
As we prepare to address and to lament in the public space, I hate that this is the case today. But how important would it be in that moment, or would it be more appropriate in like follow-up conversations with people to avoid the politicization?
Yeah.
However you.
Yes, we hear you.
Because like, you talk about Ferguson. and how there's the lament around the black community.
Yep.
But there's also the lament around the police community. Even now, you have the lament around the coronavirus, but then there's also xenophobia that is beginning to creep up. Could you just speak a little bit to how we as leaders can not just lament over, or maybe we just simply lament over situations and let our people be the people, or do we also speak to as broad as we can?
Do you want to ask my hand up my back?
You got it.
Okay.
I haven't thought of it, but.
Okay. You want to share?
No, go for it.
No, I think you should share.
I think you should. Whoever has the mic, rules. Whoever has the mic.
Yes, I mean, we should not polarize. I have to speak from like white spaces. If we're talking about an issue in the black community into a white space, I don't care what you say, how soft you say it, how peaceful you say it, how biblical and theologically sound you say it, chances are, like, it's gonna piss some people off. Like, that's just the reality. And so we have to be maybe a little more bold than we want to be without taking a political stance, right? Like, you don't want to do that. But it's not to take a political stance to say an unarmed black child was gunned down by police.
Yeah.
You don't have to get up there and rant and rave about police. But you can say that that's, the heart of God is never condoning of violence.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's still going to make everybody, you've got to speak into that though, right? And forgive me for just doing the black and white thing again today, but that's my context, and so that's what I feel comfortable speaking into and whatever. But there.
Do you want to speak into that for a minute?
Okay. Like, you, in the white you have to speak into those things. Like, we are the only ones who can avoid that, right? So that's why we can't. And that's probably not the best answer in the world, but Luigi?
Just two thoughts. One is state the facts, I think is something that Mike said. And it takes a lot of time in preparation to be able to distance my feelings, my thinking from the actual facts. Yeah. Because it is hard to argue against facts. And that's what Mike is saying. There's this connotations behind thoughts, feelings, and all of that. But if you can state facts, it's very difficult to argue with those. And the other thought is...
Although in this day and age, it's very easy to argue with those. Let's just call that out and say that there is no...
Fake news. Yes.
Yeah, and especially in some of our churches, sharing facts is that might be your facts act, but that ain't my fact. That's it used to be... Right. Those used to be more anchored, and now they're not. I mean,
Sure.
This conversation 10 years ago was easier than it is, I think.
Sure. And
I didn't...
No. But I would say, and here's the hard work is that not all of them can be facts. That we are allowing our emotion and our positions, and here's the other point that I wanted to make, and forgive me for, again, using colors, but the problem is we are trying to see everything as black and white. We have this binary, especially, forgive me, but North Americans have a way of seeing everything through black and white binary thinking, which, if I may argue, it does violence to the very kingdom of God, who came to enter into the gray areas of our society to say the kingdom of God is neither like that nor like this. The kingdom of God is the one that can see, well, if you knew, if you were really a prophet, you would know that this woman is, and here are some facts. But the kingdom of God has a way of entering into the gray area and dismantling the binary. So while I agree, I think that the discussion and debate is heated because we're dealing with binary people that come with binary issues. And I do think one of the roles of the pastor is to be able to speak from the pulpit in a way that brings people into the gray area of a kingdom of God that knows how to handle those things differently. Just like Jesus said it, like, yeah, but I came and nobody gave me water to wash my feet. This woman, and he has a way of taking away that your black and white dualistic binary argument and take it into let's go down to the funeral home and experience what this family that just lost a child is experiencing. Like there's no argument. So it is really tense. And here's when you piss people off and you have to say, I know a pastor who during elections, this is what he speaks. He says, we pray for all. We endorse none. Allegiance to Jesus Christ only. Now, a lot of people left his church. Those are binary people that are not living in the kingdom of God, gray, messy, entering. When God becomes king, he enters into spaces that the church is fearful to enter into. So even being able to say, well, yeah, you're defending your own facts. You're not really exploring what this other person is going through. And so I think it's disarming some of those binary arguments. That's important.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'm going to go any further with this, so reflect what, is there any other thoughts that need to be out here? Questions?
As a group, why don't we share some passages? This is a little off topic, but like rather just space in the service, but what are passages, like you mentioned, like the Lament of Rachel is one, you mentioned them Psalms, like I preach a lot when it comes to like Samaria. I think it's a great place to start to help people understand that historical context and how we have our own Samarias we create. But what are other passages that some of you might preach from regularly that helps bring this up from a very biblical foundation? Like you're not just like dropping it on people. It's like, hey, this has been an issue for the kingdom for a long time. So what are some passages maybe? Do you have a go-to one?
I have one. I use a lot the hourly workers that got hired at the end of the day and got paid the same as everybody else. Yeah. I use that one precisely to address the issue of, man, goodness in God seems like unjust and unfair to those who started early on.
Yeah, that's good.
Any other passages that you use?
Is this a hesitancy to speak up, or a we're not doing this well enough?
Or
that would help us. Yeah, right. Speak to us. Come on now.
It's Thursday too, so
yeah. Yes, I understand that. That's why.
Well, when Luigi was talking about the non-binary and where I kind of thought you were going, and I thought it could be used was when Jesus flipped upside down. They're about to stone the woman caught in adultery, and he says, he was without sin, cast the first stone. So it doesn't speak to racial relations and dialogue or whatever, but it does speak to kind of changing that binary thinking into, hey, where are we in the story?
Yeah.
And along those same lines, there is neither male or female, slave nor free. We're erasing that binary.
The Luke 4 passage where Jesus basically gives his mission statement from quoting Isaiah, and then you preached on it, and then that's the part that we focus on. But the real part that almost gets you thrown off the cliff is when he tells them you have to be inclusive of people that are, you have to look at the Syrian that had leprosy. You have to look at the widow from Zarephath, and they're part of this too, and they look and act nothing and worship nothing like you.
Right.
That's one that is very, very easily used. And just choose your words carefully so you don't get thrown off a cliff.
Well, kind of like what we've heard a lot this week is just the general reframing of what the kingdom of God looks like, right? Like, I mean, Jesus came into a world where they were looking for a Messiah that was going to overthrow Rome. And he's like, you guys are thinking too small. Like, you're not looking at what things are or can be. And I think we see glimpses of that today still, right? Like in Westernized Christianity.
Another one is the life of Moses. Because you look at the violence in the life of Moses. I mean, Moses was given a place of privilege, but basically Moses stepped out into the ghetto for all intents and purposes. And then went and hung out in a foreign land, married someone whose wife is Zipporah, whose name meant black. So all of this sort of imagery is drawn into this, and you can use various parts of that to walk through some of this, and you can superimpose other, so that it's not just a black-white issue as far as people goes, or a black-white binary issue like what you're talking about. There's a lot of gray areas in which Yahweh steps into the middle of those situations.
You talk about Paul and the great pains he takes to pull Jews and Gentiles together and trying to kind of deprivilege Jews and have them and Gentiles in on the same basis on faith, and what does it look like to live as a reconciled community. Paul does a lot with trying, how do you live together as a new community in Christ, and he deals with a lot of issues around that in his letters. So there could be a lot to mine from those in different passages, I think.
One of our favorites that we come back to a lot is the concept of hospitality, like in Hebrews when he talks about like it being welcoming the stranger. And the idea that if you welcome the stranger and they leave still a stranger, you have not been, like they have to become part of the community now. They're not a stranger anymore. So that's a huge thing. And then the other concept along those same lines that we talk about a lot is the sheep and the goats passage, and whatever you did for the least of these is usually where that's what we say. Like I just said that. But he doesn't say whatever you do for the least of these. Like he says, whatever you do for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine. Like we always say, we're ministering to the least of these. Like we're defacing, right? Going back to day one. And Jesus doesn't say the least because they're less than. He says society has pushed that. And I'm going to call them my brothers and sisters. And that's the community he lives in, right? And so reframing those things so that it's all right.
I use what I've used before is the Samaritan woman at the well. When we talk about the people that we don't see and don't want to see, that she's somebody that wanted to remain invisible and everybody else wanted her to remain invisible.
And I would encourage everyone that as we teach these things, don't keep the kingdom bar high. We have a tendency when we teach these things to lower it. Hospitality biblically is not having the Super Bowl party at your house. It is not welcoming the stranger. It's philoxenos. It is welcoming the foreigner. It's very clear, and we have made it like, because I'm an extrovert, I'm hospitable, I have the gift of hospitality. And the clear message to you as leaders in the church, every list of leadership, not just following Jesus, but leading for Jesus, has philoxenos, which is a radical countercultural thing in the first century till today. Loving xenos, loving foreigners living among you. Like, God does have favorites. It's the quartet of the oppressed. And it's like, how do we teach into that and help people see that? How do people understand, like, the radicalness of Samaria
like especially, I mean, all throughout from the time it developed with Assyrians, but like all the way through the first century, like if we can help people understand, I mean, better to eat pigs than Samaritan bread. I mean, that was real. It was like, you can't have table fellowship with those people. It's better to like, have pork than do that. And it's like, sometimes it helps, at least when I teach it to, they're like, I can't believe those people. You sneak up behind them. Like, how dare they treat those people that way? Like, help them understand the radicalness of what Jesus did, and then be like, oh yeah, but how do we, cast it in the same light? I think sometimes we lower it to something that we can accomplish in our own, rather with the power of the Holy Spirit. So, anyways, so we'll keep having discussions, but then I wanted to share just briefly. We've talked a lot about like the words, the talking, the dialogue, the discussion. If you're involved in activities or actions related to justice in your community, relating to working with and towards and empowering the other among you, there's a few approaches most churches take. The one that I'm most used to is the needs approach, where you convene a meeting in your church or your community, you talk about the problems and concerns in your church or your community, you survey others, and then you create a laundry list of the negatives, like all the junk that is in your church and community. And then you probably hope that maybe you can get a grant or some outside person or organization to come in and fix some of those negatives. That's what I was used to doing for years. And then, at least at our church, we started doing this asset approach where you kind of say, what do we have in the room? Our church was less than 20 people. But we had a building, and it was on the intersection that was the most traversed intersection in our whole county. While the building was falling down and all the roofs needed replaced, it kept rain out of most of the facility, so that was a win. We had a diverse group in that 20. We had a lot of gifts and dreams in that 20. We started looking instead of outside, like how can other people fix us? It was like, what do we already have at the table? I had just come from a place of brokenness, living in Mozambique, Africa, doing church planning and stuff. And so like, that was actually an asset for us to come from brokenness and in a messy place. I didn't think you could find healing like in a toxic cesspool. Like we went to close a church, so it was like, I don't want to do that. But it was like, we found healing in that place. That was an asset. And then the whole point is like, okay, then how do we, now that we know all this stuff exists in our church, we have people that do have hopes and dreams and abilities. We have, this retired missionary that's bilingual. That's an asset. We have this person that has a passion for education and literacy, and they love reading books to little kids, but they're retired and don't have a place to do it. Like you start kind of tracking all this stuff. We do it. We have maps all over the place. And so like we put Post-it notes all over the maps, like, oh, over here we have this in the community, and over here we have this. In our church we have this and that. And you start just building relationships. Because I get pissed off when maybe in your community you have this, like where people in need call through the phone book. We went from Riverview Wesleyan to the Bridge, and so we jumped up to the B's. And so I was tired of saying, oh, we don't do that. It's like, I know who does. Like, I'm in a relationship. Like no one ever can leave the phone until, like, I might not be able to do it in our church, but I should know my community enough to know who does. And that takes intentionality of saying, where are the assets in my community? Like, I think a lot of us go to a new community and we see all the gaps, but I always tell people, until you find the dots, you don't know, and start connecting them, like where the gaps are. I am frustrated now. I've been in my community for 8 years. When new clergy come in and start telling me all the problems with my community, like a few weeks in, and I'm like, have you met anyone yet? Have you talked to anyone? Have you explored what the great things about our community are? And so I would just encourage you to kind of maybe go back and take that asset approach. It's very empowering for your people. Our church at 20 launched the third church-based legal office in the nation, and since then we've launched 21 others in a network that we lead. And the reason I think God chose to use us first is whatever excuse you have, our facility was in more disrepair. I didn't get paid anything, so like if it's like a money thing, we didn't have paid staff or anything like that. If you think your church is small, I guarantee mine was smaller. Like, we were the most dysfunctional, messed up thing, and God chose to use us, I think, to kind of say, if I could do it there, let's remove all the excuses that we might have of why your church can't be involved in building up shalom in your community and kind of being a central place. We have been blessed that there have some authors have told our story in books and stuff, and sadly, pastors have read those books and thought we were really something special. And as a pastor, you only have a few vacation Sundays a year to go try to check out other churches. We've had several come and be very, very disappointed. They wasted their Sunday coming to our church because they thought they were going to see something, I think, really magnificent. And instead, they just saw that God seems to enjoy using the weak and the small and accomplishing much for him. But it took that change of saying, like, instead of a needs-based approach of, like, here's all the problems and the negatives and all the reasons why we can't, it was like, well, what if? What if, like, all that God needs is in the room, and with the power of His Holy Spirit, we can really do something. And so I'd encourage you, if you haven't already done that, like, go back to your church and just look, like, what are the assets we have? Like, not only, if you have a building, that's a massive asset. Like, how can we use this for the sake of the kingdom? Now in our church, it's like we have an immigration legal services office that served over 2,000 immigrant families. We have a coffee shop in our church. We have incubated a lot of nonprofits because it's like we have the space. So if you want, like, I don't want to be in charge of everything, but I have space. So if you want to do a housing coalition, here's space. Like, if you want to do something for foster, here's space. And so I would just encourage you to kind of take that approach. And the final thing I'll say, and then we can just talk more about some of this stuff, is this has probably been, at least for me, the framework that has been just the most profound in the past 8 years. This is Timothy Keller, if you haven't already heard this, on Shalom. It's like you could dump 1,000,000 threads on the table and nothing would happen. They'd just be threads lying on top of each other. Well, we're called to be more than 1,000,000 threads. We're called to be a fabric, for everything to be woven together and interdependent. Threads become fabric when each one has been woven over, under, around, and through each other one. The more interdependent they are, the more beautiful they are. The more interwoven they are, the stronger and warmer they are. Your community has thousands of entities. We were not made to be an aggregation. Rather, you are made to be in a beautiful, harmonious, knitted, webbed, interdependent relationship with one another. There are places where the fabric has been worn down and even torn. And it's in these places we are called to reweave shalom, sacrificially threading and lacing and pressing our time, goods, power, and resources into the lives and needs of others. It means we go to the places of our community where the fabric of shalom has been broken down, and we concentrate there. We place ourselves there to reweave and repair the fabric. And daily, I think in my community, it's like, you get those tastes in your community and ministry where shalom, it's like everything. This is a taste of the kingdom to come. Like, everything seems to be right. There is hope and life and fullness. And there's places where it's like, not here. And then it's like, you could do one thing like we used to do with the Samaritan. You could avoid right there. You can, like, those jeans are ripped, so we'll throw them away. We don't have use of them anymore. You can say, like, I think that's where Jesus would be. Like, how do I press my time and energy into those areas? And so that's, at least for me, like, been a great, like, picture for how you do justice and shalom in your community. Is like, whatever it is, whether it's racial reconciliation, whether it's serving immigrants or creating third spaces for lonely people or dealing with people with mental illness or addiction, whatever. And so the question that, like, I always leave people with is that, like, what are the places in your community where the fabric has been worn down and even torn? And then really the question now is, what is your first step or next step as a follower of Jesus and also as a pastoral leader of, like, what are you going to do about it? Like, instead of just pointing to it and say, oh, it's like a gap, that's a negative thing. How do you work through that? I'm trying to think if I have. Yeah, so there's some more questions, I think. So, like, how would you do that in your community? Because you might be in a community that, like, we've talked a lot about racial reconciliation, but you might say, like, my community isn't diverse, so that's not it for me. Like, what is it? Is it that, everyone in my school system has a free lunch, and so there seems to be a food disparity, or it seems like there's a lot of people now who are underemployed, so I have the working poor that I'm dealing with all the time, and it's easy to cachet and say like, we'll get, do more, but it's like they're doing all they can. So I don't know what it might look like for you, but just want you to think through that. So that's all the content we kind of have. We wanted to give a bulk of the time. We have another like 30 minutes or so. If you guys have questions, if you have comments, if you want to share what's on your heart, our time is yours. So.
So Aislinn mentioned, that sometimes, often, you'll have people in your community who aren't ready for a dialogue. That they just aren't to that place yet. So what are some very early preliminary steps that could be taken to gently move them in that direction, possibly without them knowing that you're moving them in that direction? Do you have any kind of suggestions for ways to gently push them toward being ready for that?
For me, it's the most powerful thing you have is the table. So use it. So for us, what that means is we do a lot of table fellowship, so a lot of like taste of, and it's like, hey, come eat some good food, and then we make sure that the people at the table are different. Sometimes we'll even do conversation things where it's like, my granddad was a Polish immigrant, so like I could talk about cabbage all the time as like a favorite food. I don't know why. Cabbage is terrible. Like that's all we had in this garden. But it's like, I can sit next to my Haitian brothers and sisters and my Salvadoran brothers and sisters. Like, what's your favorite food? We have questions already there for them. And so we brought all the leaders into our community, and like so the mayor has always sat at tables and eaten together. And I think for us, like we've had dialogue, but that's where it started, was just like the table fellowship. We're like, let's just eat together and talk about some things that aren't tough topics. It wasn't like, hey, how many times have you been pulled over by the police this month? It was like, what's a tradition you love about home? Or what's something that you love, my city's Logansport, like what's something that you like about Logansport? And you just kind of start the dialogue there. That's helped us, because then people are terrified of the Maria and Mohammed they don't know, but love the ones they do. So we have people, like I was sharing yesterday, I have a friend who came to faith in our church who grew up in the identity movement, which is a hate group that believes people of color don't have a soul. Well, the reality is his dad now comes to our church and things like that, and he'll get in arguments because when people say, oh, all immigrants are this, he'll be like, well, I know Jorge, and he's not that. It's like once you have a name and a face and a relationship, you can talk about issues and teach about issues, but until you have table fellowship, which is what the enemy wants us to make sure we never have. So, and churches are good at it too. Like we love food, right? And so it's like, how do we do that and bring other people to it? That's what we do.
Can I add one thing? No, you go ahead then.
Sure. Let me first of all thank you for doing this. It has been very enlightening and impactful. And many of the illustrations that you shared are still with me. The provocative language is still wrestling, so I'm grateful for that. There's a book, it's an old book called In His Steps, What Would Jesus Do? By Charles Sheldon. And one of the things he wound up doing is living in other people's footsteps. And sometimes when we're trying to do ministry, we can easily come across as if we call them, and that right there is offensive. Because it presupposes that we're here and they're there.
Yeah.
All of us have gifts and talents and come with a lot of riches. But we allow their inadequacy to blind us to think that there is nothing there. I say that to say this, that sometimes when we are trying to help people, we make them feel like projects.
Yeah.
And we have no idea what they're going through. And I love the example about going to the funeral so you can see and experience. Because it's difficult to understand a culture or the way people do things or respond to things when you don't have a clue. You have not walked in their shoes and you have not eaten at their table. So you don't have a clue in understanding what's going on. But we'll say them, those people, those kind, in a heartbeat, not knowing that it's very offensive when we say things like that. Now, I heard the gentleman over here say Zipporah means black. I'm not denying, I thought it meant bird. But what did that mean by being black? What was the significance in bringing that up? That's my question. So, when you bring it up, are you saying that black is derogative? For her to be black? Whoever said
I'm the one that said that.
Okay.
And go ahead and speak, and I'll
So
respond
is
to
it
you.
saying that black is derogative, that there's something wrong? Because judges wear blacks. Most of the times when we graduate, we wear black robes. So there's some positive things that go along with the color
Right.
black. But just listening to you, and of course it may have been out of context, it comes across derogatory. So I'm not sure what you were saying, but just that alone, put out into the atmosphere, causes tension to some of us. Because there's no full understanding of what you were saying. It's left hanging. So it causes dissension, among us, not understanding exactly where you're coming from. So, and I'm not sure, it doesn't mean that you were, but the way it was presented and left unexplained, it comes across the lines.
Can I speak to that?
Sure.
Okay. Actually, I would never, ever mean it in that context. What I was, my particular context, as I mentioned yesterday to Jason, Mike, my context is in rural Alabama, and it is, my congregation averages about 70 years old, every single one of them white. Every one of them white. They look alike, they talk alike. That is way out of my particular comfort zone. I like more diversity. And to even mention that and to draw on the fact that that would challenge that simple statement that I made about Zipporah meaning dark-skinned or ebony, that kind of thing, that would challenge them. And then in that moment, as we were talking about what are things that you could use to kind of challenge, to draw them into the gray spaces, I could challenge them in a way that would invite them into a gray space to expand, not to change their belief on a particular story, but to expand their view on a story they already know. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of where I was going with that. I would never, ever mean anything offensive toward anyone's skin color, toward anyone's nationality, toward their gender, or anything like that. And I'm glad you bring that up because I'm glad you bring that up because how we choose our words matters. We need to be intentional, and we need to make sure that we're keeping the scope wide enough to include everyone that's...
Would you let me jump in for a second?
Oh, please.
Just for the sake of an exercise. So if this is a dialogue, this is awesome, and here's where facilitators help in affirming precisely we want to explore now what was meant by saying this, and it was perceived this way, and to actually invite the room to say it's okay to feel that way, and it's okay to raise that question and say, I did not understand it, what do you mean? And so what you're seeing here is something that is actually really beautiful and needs to be elevated. Yep. So that there's no tension in saying, because the question was simply, what did you mean by that? Because I sensed that this way. And it is awesome to be able to pronounce that and to be able to say, I feel this way, and it happens all the time. So to actually stop and say, thank you for modeling great dialogue and letting yourself enter into this exploration of what do we mean by when we say this. Does that make sense? So I stood up just to show you how practical this could be, and it's a great teaching moment to show dialogue works, and you reaffirm we have rules, we're just exploring, and that's the role of the facilitator. Does that make sense? Yeah, what are you gonna say now?
Go ahead, man.
Facilitate. No, those are really, again, I think getting close to understanding. Often in the Bible, we impose our frameworks on the reading of the Bible, right? So it is easy to in the relationship with Moses and his wife, The real conflict there is that Moses married up to a woman of color. In that culture, what they were telling Moses is actually like, you think you're Moses and get to lead us because you marry up? And that is a real tension. And remember when there was the rebellion and all that? No, he was the leader because God told him to lead, right? Same happens often with the eunuch that is Ethiopian, and that Philip comes to. I don't know why I stand. It's just like,
no, you're good.
But it is so often we kind of impose our own thinking of here comes eunuch, here comes Philip, who is the Christian, and sometimes we put color on he is probably the white and comes to an Ethiopian, and if you read that in context, you discover that one, he is the one that serves a queen. So the context is trying to show you a power dynamic. He's a eunuch, but this is not bad. This is great because he serves in a kingdom, and he's Ethiopian, which is probably referring to the farthest part of Africa, what we call today. They would not call it that. And what you're seeing is Philip is meeting with someone that has a lot of privilege and is very important, so much so that he has scripture. Synagogues, entire synagogues would not have access to their own scriptures because it was so expensive to make copies. So for a person to have a scroll of Isaiah, we're talking about a person that's privileged, and then God uses Philip to bring the gospel. And I think what Acts is trying to say that by meeting the Ethiopian, the gospel is beginning to go to the end of the world. Right? So sometimes our way of reading can we infer our social nuances, but we gotta be careful. And this is why it's awesome to preach from the Bible and shift those presuppositions about power and dynamics and language. And you get the privilege of doing that. So do read the Bible and begin to see how the gospel kind of decentralizes power structures to bring the kingdom of God. So I just kind of wanted to say that. I am from Colombia, South America, and often the presupposition is that he comes from a third world country. So I have to kind of come, and at first I used to get offended. Now it's like I gotta explain to people like where I come from. Most people don't know the only place where I've ever gone hungry is in the United States. Mm-hmm. It's the only. It's completely, so that's different. Can I share another one? Yeah. I get excited, sorry. We did the privilege walk in a room where it was all the important people of the university. The president of our university was there. And we did the privilege walk. If you don't know what that is, it's just like someone calls a privilege, and if you've had that privilege, you give a step forward. And if you haven't, then you stay where you are. And you kind of end up with a room that shows who has privilege. And I was with the people, the powerful people of the university, and kind of ended up in the center of privilege. And someone said, he must not understand how this works. And it was one of those realizations that is like, no, we have this way of seeing the world. The reality is, and I didn't even realize this, but no, I've never gone hungry. My parents are highly educated. My grandparents were highly educated. Like all the questions that they were asking you, it was like, but the assumption is third world country, poor little kid, he speaks Spanish, he didn't understand the exercise. So it is worth challenging those presuppositions and saying, no, right? So thanks for modeling part of the dialogue. Other questions?
And before we take a couple more questions and have discussion, I do want to say, and I should have said this at the beginning of the week, as an apology, we haven't modeled this very well in this. If you've noticed, there's two white guys up here, and Luigi, another male. Coloma should have been here. He's usually here. He's He's from Jamaica, and
we
he
need
teaches in the
chaplains
MEZ.
here, we need-
Sophia's was supposed to be here, so we had a few people that would have made like I'm up here only because we had some people drop out at the last moment because we try to model that in this, and this year we did not model that well. You've heard from a bunch of dudes, and so
Yeah.
And Chase was going to be here today to be a part of the discussion too, but he does so much with the music. He asked that he could have some time. So, anyways, just so you understand, we messed up. Other questions, comments, thoughts?
Can you talk a little bit about perhaps how to balance the need to be both prophetic and pastoral? Perhaps in preaching, but also just in general. I was thinking in the context of the lament conversation, like when something major happens, or even when we're doing some of these asset conversations, or when we're trying to figure out what we have to offer, and also where there are gaps in those dot connections in our communities.
Forgive me, can you ask that in if you can't, that's fine, in a more specific way? Because I feel like my answer to what you just said is going to swing way on one side. So can you say it again and give me some time to...
Yeah, so I'm thinking about, sometimes there is a tendency when we go the prophetic route to speak down to our communities or to make people feel badly about themselves. And so I'm wondering how to honor the fact that people are still feeling real emotions, but also to call them to work for justice. Is that a better framing?
Yeah. I don't know if I'm the one to answer.
You got the mic, so remember that's what you said.
I don't have a good answer, to be honest with you. You guys got anything?
I mean, I don't know that I have a great answer. I think I love focusing on multi-ethnic ministry, and I think I learned one thing: you cannot lead a multi-ethnic ministry unless you live a multi-ethnic life.
Yes.
And I would say my default is more pastoral than prophetic, but the closer I get to people and the more I risk in my relationships to get closer to things that I'm used to ignoring, the more prophetic that I've seen my transformation. So I would default more on the pastoral. But so I get to enter into the home of a Muslim, or I've never been in those spaces, and now my exposure forces me to speak differently. So I would just say stay close to the issues. I don't think anyone has the right to speak from a platform about issues that they have not really explored and entered into. So that is it's extreme. So I would say the best exercise to have balance would be to spend time in those spaces. Let me just say, I think this way. Like, you need to go to AA meetings to be able to talk about anything on recovery. Like, sit there and experience that. And it is uncomfortable. Like, sometimes you just gotta find the brave soul that's gonna go with you to the places that you don't wanna go. But as you get exposed to those places, I find myself, the balance is a lot easier. Because now I care about it. And because now when someone that has not been exposed to that speaks, I can bring a little more of a prophetic and an invitation saying, come with me, enter into this space. I will go with you, let's explore it. And the non-threatening would be the table. That's another way where you show how pastoral, and it allows you to be more prophetic from a pulpit, because they've seen you at the table, they've seen you in the community. So the table, and the more tables you can create and opportunities for people to go. Someone might not go to an AA meeting with you, but they may be willing to try a new restaurant with food that they've never explored, and they see your relationship with the owner, and those things show pastoral care.
And everyone should know your own default and your church's default there, because because I mean that helped me. Nico kind of co-pastors with me. He's so pastoral. I'm very prophetic. So I don't like a win for me. It's like that's not a win because that's not exactly what God. If God was mayor of our town, it would look this way. And he goes like, "Is that for real? Like, is that what you're?" And so like knowing that I think is important. I was supposed to speak at a conference once, and the organizer was like, "Hey, you need to talk about doing things because." It was an AMZ person, and she was saying the reality is we talk about this, but we don't do it. And I said, well, my tradition's different. We never talk about it, we do it. And so knowing what church you are, like sometimes you preach about things, but you're not in a relationship. Other times you're in a relationship, but you never talk about them. So kind of just knowing, that's been freeing for me. Luigi's helped me in a lot of those things. Like, okay, here's my default. I come into every situation this way, so how do I lean or make sure there's other people to balance it? I think it's important.
And I was going to say, the deeper I love my community, my congregation, the more prophetic I'm able to be. You know, so that's, and I default to the prophetic. That's why I didn't really want to answer it, because I'm way up, and I'm able to love. For me, it was loving the white people in my congregation, learning to love them differently, and being able to speak more bold to them once that relationship has been established. And does that make sense? So, yep.
There's a image kind of thinking about that same topic that Todd Bolsinger gives in his book on Canoeing the Mountains. And it's the image of a pressure cooker, that every organization or a church is like a pressure cooker. And he uses it to talk about urgency and loving trust. And he's like, if there's no pressure in the pressure cooker, it's never going to cook. But if there's too much pressure, it's going to explode. And so you're constantly gauging the emotional temperature of your group. Because I guess the danger, if you're too prophetic, you blow things up and you piss people off and they leave and they don't want to deal with you anymore. If you're too pastoral, you never get anything done, or you never push people in ways that they need to go. So we're constantly taking that temperature. Are you applying enough pressure? That was a helpful illustration, I guess, for me, for thinking about that.
Right.
So I think that what Mike said is exactly the right answer, that if you've been pastoral with someone and loved them well already, then being prophetic is not threatening to them in the same way, because they know that you love them. And so when you already have that relationship of trust, then you can speak the truth more boldly, and it doesn't offend in the same way, or drive them away, or make them defensive. They can hear you because they know that you already have that relationship. You know, I'm from Mississippi. I'm not from Mississippi, but I live in Mississippi. And my husband, I was debating whether to tell this story because it could very possibly be offensive. And there will probably be diverse ideas about what the right thing to do was. So I will acknowledge that ahead of time. But my husband's former church, not the current one, they had a regular Sunday morning men's breakfast. It was just men in the church. They were all older than my husband. And it was once a month, and they'd go, and Chad kind of hated going because he wasn't really sure what was being accomplished there. And about 3 or 3.5 years in, there was discussion happening. Someone was telling a story, a man in his 60s, and he dropped the N-word in casual conversation in the church building on Sunday morning. And you know, so the question is, what do you do? You know, do you come out like a blazing prophet and slap them to the ground for what they just said? You know, which is the knee-jerk reaction. This is what you want to do. But in that context, my husband knew that this man didn't just casually drop the N-word. He did it on purpose. Right. He hadn't said it for 3 years or 3.5 years, whatever it was. But he was willing to say that word, and he did it in front of the preacher on Sunday morning in the church building on purpose. Like, this was not an accidental slip of the tongue sort of situation. No one in Mississippi, no white person left alive in Mississippi, casually drops the N-word and doesn't understand the context, or does not know that what they've said is offensive. This is not a reality anymore. Maybe 50 years ago, but not now. And so he said it on purpose. And so Chad sat there and kind of thought about it and did not correct him, because it was a test. You know, Chad already had tensions with this man's brother at the other church on the charge. And so he already knew the family dynamic and the conversations that were happening between the family members surrounding his leadership in the church. And so by not slapping him for what he said, Chad was loving him better and loving him in defiance of himself. You know, he wanted to drive Chad away, and Chad did not let him. And so, but it's one of those things that, you know, when Chad told me this story, you know, I wasn't there were no women present, of course. When Chad told me the story, I mean, my knee jerk was like, what did you say? You know, and Chad did not say anything because that was the most loving response that he could offer to that hateful word. And it was the most loving thing he could do for that man who was doing his best to offend. And he didn't let him offend. And so, anyway, like I said, it's a loaded topic and a loaded story. And I'm sure that there are people who feel very differently and would have done differently. But when we left, it wasn't just a matter of my husband and this man being on good terms, but Chad could still speak to him and he could still hear Chad. Whereas if Chad had reacted how this man wanted him to react, that would have been the end of him being able to hear him. So I put that out there. Prophecy is really hard. And sometimes refraining from prophecy is even harder. So
Luigi, will you pray over the, I know we could talk, this is the problem. We could talk for hours and have a lot more to cover, but I'm looking at the time. Will you just pray for the group as they go back into their community, build relationships, follow God's leading?
Yep. Heavenly Father, we are humbled to be in your presence because we are the lost ones. We are the one sheep, and you've left 99 to find us. But now we are also the 99. And we want to have your heart to find others as well. God, we thank you that your kingdom has come and that you are doing your will. That these dreams that we have of seeing our communities walking in wholeness are not just ideals, but it is the proclamation of our gospel that you have come, the kingdom has come, and that you are doing your will on earth as it is in heaven. And at times, God, it feels like we're losing. At times it feels like the culture is winning. At times it feels that division reigns. At times it feels like every effort that we put in is not producing fruit. But you remind us that we should not grow weary of doing good. That in fact, you've given us a revelation, an epiphany, an unveiling that the kingdom of God has come, that ultimately every knee shall bow and will confess that you are name above all names, God. And we stand on that truth, and we stand in the gap praying for our communities, for brokenness, for anxiety. Lord, bring shalom, bring your peace, and may we be heralds of this good news of peace. And Lord, when we are growing weary and tired and desperate, would you let your spirit fall upon us? I pray for everyone here, for families, marriages, some who are starting new ministries, some who are trying to figure out how to revitalize ministries, some who have seen ministries die. In all of those situations, may your spirit and your presence come. And may we know, God, that you're the one that builds your church. That in vain we work if we're just trying to build it on our own strength. Lord, come and build. Come and heal, restore. We surrender to you one more time, and we pray that you would help us shepherd and bring a prophetic voice to our communities. That you would give us creative ideas like never before, to be able to be exposed and reach the others, and to model what it looks like when Jesus comes into the house. and that when there is this sense of there's strange things that we don't understand, that you would somehow speak into those situations and show us that those who truly love you and care for you, God, will receive this kingdom. So bless us, I pray, give us wisdom and a great day today in your name. Amen.
Feel free to keep conversations going. Please fill out the assessment because I think Bonnie's going to be in the hallway and wants to collect those. So if you could fill those out real quick, we'd be super, super grateful.
Stephen, who are you putting down to request for the?
I'm sorry. Someone asked something.
Corey would be a good one. The other person I was thinking you could do Scott Woodburn.
Hear the voice.
Or you could.
I don't know him
Thanks,
personally.
brother.
I think I've already done Cameron. I did Cameron all on here.
You know, we're needing the.
Have you done their email addresses too?
I would just put it on yours and then they'll send you an email.
3245.
I send you an email.
I want to do Emma and sleep. I want to do Emma and Zach.
Yeah, I don't think anyone.
I think I could do a fourth. I don't
I
think
could be
they'll
wrong, but
do you want to cross
just
off
in case someone shows up, I can. I mean, like, I'll be there with you.
Then you
but,
and
like,
Scott, and then I'll
that
do
is not.
Emma and Zach.
I have more questions
All
than
their
answers
email
on that,
addresses
and
are
I'm
on
probably
the
not the right facilitator to be there as a white dude to think through some of that. So
Oh, it's, I think
yeah, so
Molly, Michael Jefferson.
it'll be. We meet out here.
You don't think he'd be good?
2:30, 2:45, something like that.
No.
And that's all
Why not?
we got going on. Hey, so in the midst of, will you take? I can do later.
So I'm doing.
Like as you're in different places, that's that thing we're doing in August that you're. Well, no, this is for Immigrant Connection, yeah. And I was just thinking, you're in places like with the seminary and stuff like that, that like, you'll have a bigger marketing push closer to general office. If you're ever around people who like have a heart for it, you can at least give them that and it tells them like, kind of the save the date thing or whatever.
Even non-Christians? Or this is really...
I think it's mainly like church. Right.
Yep. Yeah. So, I want to talk to you about other communities.
There should be a lady standing in the hallway saying, "Maybe you're supposed to bring that." I don't understand.
He's trying to do things there too. So
Yeah.
it may not be a bad idea to.
Yeah, and I think if I've learned anything from River Welcome Center, it's like learning that Immigrant Connection really works with local churches and like, because I wanted to go like beyond that, but like, it changed, it's like, how do we like, can we create something that's a collaborative effort that we have a seat at the table, that we're not leading, but we want to know where we connect with people as opposed to trying to open up to do more. I'd love to talk to you a little bit about that, because like my heart is for that as well, but it's like how do we do that? You know,
No, I
like-
was just thinking though, that they are points of channelizing and mobilizing people, like in the community, so that they don't know.
Yeah.
We have ways to help.
Yeah.
Right?
That's the story I was pointing to.
And so I do wonder how much
Yeah.
those very local communities know that we have.
Yeah, well, even letting both the synagogue and the mosque know, like, hey, if you have people that come to you that are in need, we help all kinds. It's because like sometimes people usually, you're right, there's a lack of understanding that we're here to help and like we want to help partner with you. And even if we can do intakes, if it makes it better to do it at your space, we can do that. Yeah, you're right. You know, those things definitely. The other thing I wanted to tell you about was you already have that down, that date for you.
It's August
18th, yeah. And not only will there be a session that you teach, I think you might be, I would like you to think about the different hosts. So the person, there'll be two hosts, just like what you share, like having multiple facilitators that like talk in between. And we had, when we were going to do it last year, that was when Gloria was still like kind of around, she was transitioning, we were thinking about bringing Gloria back, because she would know, but like, we just thought having it doesn't. Yeah. So, and we can talk more about folks. Like it's not a lot. It's like there's a bunch of little things, and so in between each of them, it's like the host might say something or prompt a question for people to think through or whatever.
Yeah.
But just saying like who, and I've thought maybe about even having Courtney too. You maybe come in and like you and her hosting as like so we have male, female, and immigrant type thing.
That is
Yeah.
the opposite.
So
Right, it's just you that's what I
we just were talking about it the other day.
Let's talk about it. Yeah.
Okay, so
Hey, I'm getting my wife involved.
And what's crazy is in the context of which I stand just
Yeah.
about every Sunday.
When more and more as we think
They
about
would not even be open to that.
rethinking how we
That sort of
touch Indianapolis,
Thank you for reminding me.
I think she'll be a central part of that, like finding the
It's
time
okay to take
that works for her to say like, hey, would
in
you,
these type of.
come every other week to headquarters, and with Karina and Joanna and I, as we do things there, would you go to Grace with us?
we're all doing that, we're all
And
wrestling.
do things there, but like all that stuff, I think would be great for her to be involved in. And I've talked to her about all that, and so.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
Good work today, man. Thank you.
Yeah.
Responses have been on point.
How did you get your assets discussion going?
Sure.
Because we like thought we're trying to we started Steve's pastor and the but we started at our church last July and it has assets, but we haven't figured out like what are we gonna do to like reach new people. Like did you do like we're gonna have an assets discussion or was it multiple discussions or how did you like create that environment? Because I think we have talented people in our church. It's just hard to figure out like what to.
Yeah, I think I'm just naturally wired to like, I love new ideas to a fault, like to the point that like, once something started, it could be going really great, and I'm like, okay, I'm done, like, what's next type thing. And so I was just blessed to be in an environment that like, kind of allowed that, and then to be able to tell people I also love failure, like I'm really proud of lots of massive failures in my life. So telling people like, if you have an idea, this is a dream God's put in your heart. Like we had Andres Valencia is a Colombian, and he's like, I've always wanted to do conversational Spanish classes because he's like, I'm tired of we're in a school district with all these Spanish speakers and teachers like don't even know how to like say anything. And so it's like, okay, what do you need? Oh, you need space? Okay, you need like us to, and so like kind of just when people have ideas, trying to say, okay, like we want to facilitate that, like what would it take to do it, and like letting people have the freedom to run with things. And I mean, that's that we started. And now it's become regularly sitting down, our Cass County Resource Network, so our whole county, like all the nonprofits come together at our church, and we map everything. Like, okay, if someone has a need and they can't pay their heating bill, what happens? What do we want to have happen? Like, what would be like, where are the gaps in that? And it's like, we found it out in our community. The Yale Township trustee has literally, he had $87,000 last year to give away left over. Like, and I'm like, what? We have churches that are giving all this money to things that he's in the room saying, well, I have all this money that like is given to me to give away for these needs. And so I don't need you to meet these needs, I need you to meet those needs. And once people started seeing like, oh my gosh, if we do this collaboratively and we convene things, it seems to work better. It's great. And then like right now we have maps on the wall, and like we just stick, where are the assets, and people put like, and it's funny because some of them are really detailed, and the Nico who kind of co-pastors with me, like for him it's just like Nico and there's house. It's like, well, what do you mean? It's like, well, he's just an asset. Like it's not that like he helps out with youth or he can help out with this, that. It's just him. And then other people do detailed things. But I think, and then people get excited because they're like, I've always had this idea. I've always wondered, what would our church like? What if we had a cooking class? What if we invited? Like, we have these great people who, like years ago in our church, we did this old, like this cookbook of all the things, but what if we have this kitchen in the church, we don't use it? What if like different women said, we'll create this and we'll show you how to do it? At our church, it was great because we had old white people showing like a pineapple upside down cake, and we had Latino women like, what's that? You know, and then like Latino women were like, and here's how you make pozole. And even though that we did a cooking class right when I came 8 years ago, and they didn't even know the same language, but like it was food, so you and recipes, you could figure that out. And it was solely just saying, come to this. For us, it's always with food, and share your dreams and hopes and what you think we have, and then it's your job to facilitate and say, okay, could some of these become a reality? Could some of them just be tried, and if they fail, they fail?
And how much do you kill if something that's a pretty bad idea?
I don't kill anything. Yeah, because most of the things I think are a bad idea, I realize it's just my own thinking, and so, and I mean, if it's a bad